Hey drummers, hope you're well. Just a quick one for you. Shout out to Superstar channel member Mark, who was working on this. Now this is a video on the face of it, I guess, for beginners, sort of improvers, but I've been playing the drums for the best part of 30 years, believe it or not, and I find it really helpful to think in these terms. This is simply just thinking about changing up the pulse that you're playing on the hi-hat to give some sort of musical excitement and sort of progress your groove along and just make it a bit more sort of dynamic and interesting. The reason this came up is we were talking about that thing that drummers do when they first learn the drums. And if you have lessons with me, if you start from the beginning, typically we'd sort of say, okay, here's a quarter note feel, here's an eighth note feel, a straight eighth feel, here's a 16th note feel. And we sort of learn the basic feels that drummers play. So for example, a quarter note feel, these things all refer to what your hi-hat or ride cymbal is doing, by the way. So in a quarter note feel, you know, quarter notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So very basic when you first get started. Obviously you can expand the kick and the snare. 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And you can make some very cool, successful grooves just with the quarter note pounding away. But that's the point, that's where we tend to start, isn't it? The quarter note feel, boom, gut, boom, but, and then we say, okay, what about a straight eighths feel? Like in Trinity Grade 1, they describe it as a straight eighths feel. Eighth notes on your hi-hat, all right? 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and again, even if you never change those eighth notes, you can still do a lot with your kick and your snare. But all the time, in that case, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and then we typically talk about a 16th note feel. You can play that with one stick on the hi-hat. 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a... Or as you get a bit faster, drummers start playing it with two sticks on the hi-hat, like a single stroke roll. And if you're right-handed, you typically bring your right stick to the snare to hit the backbeat. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. What Mark was saying is once you sort of get familiar with these, I think it is helpful to introduce them as like discrete things, you know, like separate things, and make a list of musical feels. That's very helpful. But of course, all that is ever is a starting point. And there's no rules in music. You can then combine those, of course. And Mark was saying, oh, he's just sitting there and playing with eighth notes and starting to throw in the 16ths with one stick and two, but particularly with two sticks on the hi-hat. So moving between like an eighth note feel on the hi-hat and the two-handed 16th note feel. Or in other words, just whizzing your left stick up to the hi-hat to make it a 16th thing sometimes. And that might mean that then you have to switch to your right stick coming to the snare drum, but that's fine. It's a nice thing to play around with. So quite often in these videos over the years, I've done something, I don't know, something like this, just casually. More often than not, the video wasn't even about this, but just casually I'll have done something like this. Something just of that nature on the hi-hat, and someone will go, what's that? Can you transcribe that? Can you notate that? Can you write that out for us? What was that? And very often, not always, but very often it's as simple as that. It's just moving between an eighth note and a 16th note feel. And sure, like the hi-hat might open and close and all that stuff, but we're not really getting into that too much today. We want to keep it simple. So let's just pick a really simple example. Say that in the first half of the bar, we went 1 and 2 and we played eighth notes. And then in the second half, we played 3E and a 4E and. It's a really goofy basic example, but let's start with that. So 1 and 2 and 3E and a 4E and a 1 and 2 and 3E and a 4E and a. You got it? So that's just changing it up, isn't it? Could you say it's a straight eighth feel or a 16th note feel? It's sort of both, isn't it? It moves between them. From that starting point, you might say, all right, I'll start to change it up a bit more frequently. So nothing massively more complicated there, just starting to make changes. And it's just a nice idea, I think, just when you're getting started with your grooves. And it's very often easy to think like, oh, the only way we can sort of change grooves up when we're just getting started on the drums. And I say the classic thing is like you do bass drum variations at first, and I've got videos about that. That's all good. And you do snare drum variations. But man, hi-hat variations, of course, it's a beautiful thing to do. Even if you keep your kick and your snare dead straight or relatively simple. There's just so much movement that comes from the hi-hat. And I've always thought this. I remember a brilliant drum teacher, I'm going to say his name probably wrong, Francis Serio, was it, a drum tech, a lot of years ago now, maybe 20 years ago now, like talking to me about this. And I really have these words ringing in my ears ever since. I've always thought this. And that is that so often the way a drummer plays on the hi-hat is actually the deciding factor. I'm going to paraphrase this and probably butcher it, but he said something like, when you get to a big venue and you're playing a big gig, imagine if you go to the O2 or Wembley Arena or something, especially in like rock or pop music, a kick and a snare, and that is a loud backbeat snare, they kind of just sound the same, don't they? If you're playing a relatively simple pattern. And I don't mean to underestimate for 1 second what's involved in playing those instruments. Obviously, there's a lot of subtlety there. But to some extent, when you're playing in that, contemporary music, boom, ga, especially if you're sitting at the back of the arena, they sound like that. And so the hi-hat, I would say, is the thing that perhaps more than anything else gives like feeling to a drummer's playing, or takes the music through levels, or can give it groove, can give it feeling. So even if you're playing 1, 2, 3, 4, what you do over here just makes such a difference to the overall feel. You get the idea. So I'm just putting it out there. Now, what I'll do on the channel members page, as usual, is I'll put some examples, as if you're sort of getting started with this. I'll put, say, 3 examples of grooves that have the move between an 8th note feel and a 16th note feel, just to give, like I say, some typical examples of the sort of thing I would play. Or put, as usual, like a simple one, and then a more advanced one, or sort of bit more funky one, and then something a bit more fun at the end. And hopefully that might just get you started, channel members, for thinking about breaking up your hi-hat a little bit and using that as a bit of a way to be creative in your groove playing, not just moving the kick and the snare. Remember, you're not set in a straight 8th feel, you're not set in a 16th note feel or whatever else. I mean, you might be. The point is, in music, sometimes that is exactly what a song needs, is for you to sit on a hi-hat pattern. But other times there is room to be more creative and just kind of putting it out there. And thanks to Mark for sort of phrasing this really nicely and bringing it to my attention in a way that I perhaps haven't said enough on this, in this channel. I don't always say enough in the lessons that where I work with people as well. It's such a great outlet for being creative in your playing and giving it individuality and making it your own, and all those sort of cliches, moving around with a hi-hat. So check that out on the channel members page, as usual, link below. Thanks to Mark, shout out to him, and thanks for watching as always. Really appreciate it. Cheers.